hybrid lectures. So I want to welcome everybody here in the room, and I also want to welcome those of you watching us on Zoom today. For those of you who are watching on Zoom, we're still getting a little used to the hybrid format. So my coworker, Sean, is going to be with you on Zoom. So if you have any questions you want to ask, he is there to relay those questions to those of us in the room here. So this lecture today is part of a lecture series we're doing as part of our new exhibit, To Come to a Land of Milk and Honey, Litchfield and the Western Reserve. And this exhibit started, it really started as the idea for like a small little exhibit. And then once our curator and archivist started digging into the story, they just kept digging and digging and digging and finding so much good information that it suddenly became this very large exhibit. And I hope you guys all take a chance to go see the exhibit today. And even after we created that large exhibit, we realized that there was still more to the story to tell, which is why we are so pleased to be offering this lecture series on telling stories of the Western Reserve, which is helping us dive a little deeper into some of these stories that, we couldn't go fully into in the exhibit. We are, of course, incredibly thankful to the financial support of Connecticut Humanities, who has provided the funding to allow us to bring in speakers like our speaker here today. And of course, as part of a grant-funded lecture series, we do have a survey that we're going to be giving out. I know those of you who came to our last lecture in this series, you probably filled out a survey. We do have a survey at the end of the lecture that I will be passing around. And for those of you joining us on Zoom, Sean will share a link in the chat. And if you wouldn't mind filling these surveys out at the end, that's how we know that we've succeeded in providing, a good experience for you. I also just want to say that we do have some upcoming events related to our exhibit. The next lecture in this series is going to be in May, and that's going to be with our curator, Alex Dubois. And if you really want to know what's coming up, we do have these little pamphlets available at the front desk where you can find all of the information about all the lectures we have. And of course, after today, we are going to have a light reception at the back of the room. So I hope that when we finish here today, you're able to stick around and join us for a little bit. And of course, visit the new exhibit. All right, so now that I've taken care of some of our housekeeping, I want to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Timothy Anderson. Anderson is the Associate Professor and Graduate Chair of the Geography Department at Ohio University, where he has taught courses in cultural and history geography since 1996. His research interests focus on the historical settlement geography of the United States, especially the production of regional and ethnic cultural landscapes. His most recent research involves a book project on the historical settlement geography of Ohio in the first half of the 19th century, which focuses on the production of the state's regional cultural landscapes resulting from the migration of 5 different population groups during the early national period. His new book, Settling Ohio, First Peoples and Beyond, is expected to drop on June 1st, I believe. Yes, June 1st, yep. So this is sort of a little sneak peek, of that book. And of course, when it does come out, we hope that you all purchase it. And also very importantly, that Tim has been a valuable member of our advisory committee for our Western Reserve exhibit from the very beginning. And so this is really exciting for us here today because after many years of Zoom and many Zoom meetings, we are finally, I know you have met some of our staff, but welcoming you here in Litchfield in person, and it's just really wonderful to have you. So please, without further ado, Tim.
Grab a little water here. Thank you, Kate, so much for that that generous introduction. Well, I'm really happy to be here in one of my new favorite places. I first came to Litchfield. I was doing some research here in the archives. Was that Linda, was that before COVID? I think it was. I think it was the summer of 2019. Just kind of really fell in love with the place. And as Kate was saying, my research is really focused on the early settlement of Ohio during the era of the early republic. So basically from about 1790 to 1830, 40, that era, which I think is one of the most important eras in the history of the country, because it was during that time that a lot of places like Ohio were being settled by various population groups coming from different parts of the East Coast. And so that's where this is going to fit in today. So I'm a geographer, not a historian, historical geographer. So I focus mainly on the geographies of the past, but I'm really especially interested in settlement and how that settlement affects the landscape, right? Things in the landscape, right? Like this church, right? Where is this? It's not across the street. It's actually in Talmadge, Ohio, right? It's a dead ringer, right? So, you know, when I remember the first time I ever came to the Western Reserve of Ohio, Talmadge was one of the first places I went, and I was just really struck. I grew up in Oklahoma and had never even been to Ohio before I took the job at Ohio University in 1996. And one of the things I realized right from the very beginning is Ohio has one of the, well, with the exception of Texas, has the largest number of different settlement regions of any state in the country. And that came about during this early national period. Sometimes it's called the federal period. So what I want to do today is offer you a contextualization, if you will. You all are the experts, right? I'm an outsider. You all know the history of Litchfield, and the archivists here and Alex you all know that history much in a much deeper way than I do. But what I think I can offer you is a context to think about that in some kind of broader ways, right? Some broader national context. That is, how does this come to be in Ohio, right? How does this kind of copy of New England come to be in Northeast Ohio, an area that I refer to as New England extended? It's really New England extended, right? Because upstate New York and Western New York was New England extended as well, but this is an extension of that even further west. So I want to use a couple of different ideas here, and I'll use these terms. One is this idea of selective migration. That is, so one of the contexts here is to think about migration, and this could be migration, not only, you know, kind of interregional migration from place to place in the United States, but this could also apply to, say, international migration in the past as well as the present. And that's this idea, when I say selective migration, is that it's the migration process and processes usually were not whole-scale movements, in this case, from Connecticut to Ohio, right? We're not talking about the entire state getting up and leaving, right? That did not happen. Rather, certain people went and certain people got involved for a number of different reasons. Sometimes it was financial, sometimes it was familial, kinship links, could be all sorts of things. And I think that's, you know, if you think back to your elementary and high school history class, I know that I came away thinking about this idea of westward migration, right, as this whole-scale wave of settlers, right, going first to Ohio and then the gold rush, and right, is this movement. But I think what research into early settlement in these different regions of the United States has shown is that it was anything but. It was in fits and starts, if you will. And so the Connecticut Western Reserve in Northeast Ohio is a perfect example of that. So certain elements of different populations were selected out, if you will, for migration. Another idea that I'm going to ask you to think about today is what I call genealogical geography. And it's this idea that places are tied together through the linkages, through kinship and familial linkages, excuse me. So that is, each one of us, right, are tied to each other through familial and kinship linkages. We're all tied together in space and time through our biological connections. And this is something that is in the field of historical geography, is something that is becoming kind of in, if you will, these days, is using genealogical data from Ancestry.com, from Family History, or FamilySearch.org, using these big, huge databases of millions and hundreds of millions of people, right? And using modern technology to really understand migration in much deeper ways. So genealogical geography is the use of family histories to analyze and reconstruct past geographies, with this idea that any given individual is tied to other individuals in time and space through biological connections. And also that family ties can be one of these selecting factors in deciding why someone goes to a certain place, right? And what I mean by that is a specific locale, a specific town, or what have you. Okay, so I want to use those two ideas. And this is kind of a really busy schematic, and I drew this really to help myself understand it as much as anything else. But the way to read this is time is going to the left on this, and space is on the y-axis. So these represent past and future generations through time and space. And here I've kind of done this, used a North American model of this. So if we think of, say, and this root place can be any place, right, where a group of people have come to. They are connected to the past and past places through past kinship and biological ties, and to future biological ties, right? So this root place could be almost anywhere. It could be Northwest Connecticut, right? So you could think of the people who settled in Litchfield town. We could do this. We could look at those folks, those original settlers, and then trace them back through time and space through past generations. So what I've done here is the root place here on this schema is really kind of Ohio, Indiana, Lower Michigan, so that what used to be called the Old Northwest, right, the Northwest Territories. That's what I've based this particular schematic on. So the great-great-grandparents of those original Ohio settlers were coming from these source areas overseas, right? East Anglia in the case of New Englanders, the south of England in the case of those from Virginia, the North Midlands of England and the British borderlands for Southeast Pennsylvania and then into the Appalachians, or Senegambia for African-American populations. And also you could put in here the Caribbean islands as well. And then these regions, these culture regions, New England, the Tidewater South, Southeast Pennsylvania, Appalachia, develop during these third and second past generations, the great-grandparent and grandparent generation, right? So this is a way to think about kind of the schematic is a way to think about. So we could in case of what we're talking about today, we could take the Western Reserve as this root place, right? So let's begin with the federal census of 1850. The 1850 federal census was the first census that asked every person enumerated, where were you born? And either at the state level or the international level. What country were you born in? What state were you born in? In subsequent censuses, they began asking, where were your parents born? And so you can get even more detailed. But for this, so really we have to if you kind of want to look at where the earliest populations that were coming to Ohio were coming from, you kind of have to start here. In the absence of, I mean, you could look for genealogical data, but if you wanted to just start here, that'd give you a basic idea. And so that's where I'm starting here. So what's amazing here is that in 1850, if you look down here, the total population of Ohio is already just under 2 million. That's in 1850. So in 1790, just 60 years earlier, there couldn't have been more than about 10,000 people of Anglo-American ancestry, sort of, white Americans in what's now Ohio. So already in 60 years, it's clear this is a place that people are coming to, right? Almost 2 million, but already in 1850, 66% were born in Ohio, right? So that tells you that you have high birth rates, high fertility rates. So what this is showing you here basically is, so this is the place of birth of those people not born in Ohio. And you can see here about 3% from New England, about 1% from Connecticut. Now, does that mean that, so this is in 1850. So this means that there are a lot more people of Connecticut heritage or ancestry. So in general, more than 2.9% of the state's population had Connecticut ancestry, right? Because this is just showing people who were not born in the state. So if you look at those data, whoops, I went the wrong way. You look at those data, I think 3 main points come out. So between about 1790 and 1850, Ohio received migrants from 3 main population groups. One was Anglo-Americans, and when I say Anglo-Americans, I mean people of British ancestry, if you go back far enough. Anglo-Americans from New England, and Connecticut leads in terms of the number of people of that ancestry from New England. A second was the Mid-Atlantic, and in fact, mainly Pennsylvania. In fact, most of those were Pennsylvania Germans from Bucks and Berks County and Chester County in Southeast Pennsylvania. And a third major group was those from the South. And when I say the South, I mean the first South, right? Virginia and to some extent Kentucky and Tennessee, but especially Virginia. So here we have, during this early federal period, the 3 streams of populations coming into the Old Northwest, into what would become Ohio. In the colonial period, those groups really kind of kept to their own devices, right? I mean, really, if you read, there was not a lot of love lost between people from New England and people from Pennsylvania, or especially Virginia, right? I mean, there was in fact, conflict over claims to land and things like that. And if you look at the congressional, the Congressional Congress, a lot of debate, right? There were already these regional differences, right? These New Englanders were Puritans, right? The people in the Mid-Atlantic were Quakers, a lot of them, or German Reform. So there were these religious ethno-cultural differences already. But during this federal period, those groups who had been kind of separated over time and space during the colonial period were coming together again. And so Ohio was this palimpsest of the new United States, which is this ethno-cultural mixture. And one of the reasons I'm so interested in Ohio is because Ohio is one of these first places where these population groups come together and begin intermixing. And that's where a new kind of American identity begins to, that's separate from these old colonial identities, begins to develop. A second major group was African Americans and members of what I call multi-ethnic groups, because if you look at the genealogy of a lot of these African Americans that were settling in Ohio during this period, so this is antebellum, right? Before the Civil War. Many of those folks, it turns out, and when I say many, I mean probably something like 75 to 80% were mixed populations, ethnically mixed. There's English ancestry, Native American ancestry, and African ancestry. And this is what makes the early Black populations of Ohio really distinctive. But that's a whole nother story. And a third major group, if you look at those numbers, was foreign immigrants. And by far and away, the number one source was from German-speaking Europe. And I say German-speaking Europe because there was no Germany, right, before 1870. So most of those folks are settling in the western part of Ohio, north of Cincinnati, between Cincinnati and Toledo. So I'm a geographer and I like to map things out. So that's what I've done here. I've mapped those 1850 data here at the civil township level. So each of those lines on the map is a civil township. Right, so it's not to be confused with a township in the New England sense, right? So when New Englanders, even today, when you say a township, you mean a town, right? I saw that as I was coming in this morning, Litchfield town boundary, right? Everywhere else in the United States, that's called a county, right? So, but these are civil townships. West of Ohio, a township doesn't even mean anything. Right, I grew up in Oklahoma, and a township is 36 square miles in Oklahoma. Right, it's not even an administrative unit. We don't have township. We don't elect people to the township government. Right, it's really only from about Ohio east that a township means something. It's an administrative unit, right, a governmental administrative unit. But at any rate, these are not counties. Each of those squares, those lines on the map, those are townships, civil townships. And so what I did is I just colored each township if 50.1% or more of that that population not born in Ohio in 1850 came from, for example, New England. I colored it one shade. So where did New Englanders go? Yeah, it's clear where they went, right? Where did Virginians go? Down here. Yeah, down here, exactly. Where did Pennsylvania Germans go? Kind of everywhere, but especially in the central parts of the state. And then where did German immigrants go? Well, one was here, and another big area was over in this area. Plus, you had some in Cincinnati and the bigger cities. Okay, so what's the geopolitical situation that these early settlers are coming into, including these folks from Connecticut going to the Western Reserve? Well, they're coming into this famous map, or the situation that is shown on this very famous map, which shows original boundaries of the eastern states and colonies before the end of the French and Indian War, right? So the French and Indian War, which is an extension of the 7 Years' War in Europe, right, which ended in 1763, that gave to the new United States. I'm sorry, 1784. The United States came into possession of all of this territory, basically east of the Mississippi. But by virtue of colonial charters signed by various kings in England, the different colonies had been promised land. Eventually stretching from sea to sea. These are the so-called sea to sea charters. And so by virtue of that, Connecticut, as you can see here, claimed land going all the way to the Pacific between these two latitude lines. Massachusetts did the same. Virginia claimed all the way up into what's now Canada, right? So this is an issue, right? That the new United States, right, after the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Revolutionary War, the United States overnight becomes one of the largest countries in the world, and it comes into possession of all of this territory between basically the Appalachians and the Mississippi. But there are issues here. One big issue is this, right? Conflicting claims. What are we going to do with Connecticut's claim to this territory? Another major issue was that this was the homeland of many different Native American indigenous tribes. So what are we going to do about that? Well, we all know the tragic story of what happened with indigenous groups, right? In essence, the American government continued the British government's idea of excluding or pushing westward indigenous groups through either kind of trumped up treaties or through outright violence, right? So this was a highly violent encounter out here on the frontier. And so the Treaty of Greenville, signed on August 3rd, 1795, in essence, this ceded the various Native American tribes who claimed what's now Ohio as a homeland, ceded that territory to the federal government. Okay, so that's one problem, right, that the federal government has with what to do with this new land that was dealt with. The other issue was, what do you do with these land claims, right? So very long story short, most of the states that claimed territory in the West ceded that territory to the federal government in exchange for the cancellation of Revolutionary War debts. Two states, however, Virginia and Connecticut, both of whom had very strong voices in Congress, were able to finagle is not a very historic accurate word, but I'll say it anyway, were able to retain some of that territory. So, for example, Connecticut's claim to this land in the West stretches back first to November of 1630, when King James I granted title to the lands between 41 degrees north and 42 degrees 2 minutes north, extending west to about 120 miles west of the present Ohio-Pennsylvania border, right? So that was that charter was given to the colony of Connecticut. In April of 1662, so 32 years later, King Charles II confirmed that 1630 patent, but extended it from sea to sea. So legally, in 1662, the western border of Connecticut was the Pacific Ocean, right? So this is an issue, right? So in 1786, Connecticut, along with the other states that claimed land in the West, ceded its western land claims to Congress, but reserved about 3.5 million acres between 41 degrees north and Lake Erie, the international border, right, border with British Canada, extending about 120 miles, or exactly 120 miles west of the Pennsylvania border. All right, so between 41 north and Lake Erie, and then 120 miles west of the Pennsylvania border. In 1792, the Connecticut legislature set aside 500,000 acres of that on the western edge of that territory to compensate Connecticut citizens whose property had been destroyed by the British Army with the help of Benedict Arnold, right, near the end of the Revolutionary War. These came to be known as the Firelands because many of those folks had their houses and property burned, right, by the British Army toward the end of the war. Sometimes they were known as the Sufferers' Lands. That is present-day Erie and Huron counties in Ohio. So that's about 500,000 acres at the very western end of this reserve. In 1795, right, so let me go back, do the math there, right? So that's in 1792. So just 3 years later, Connecticut sold 3 million acres of the reserve, so all but the Firelands on the west, to a private land company, basically a joint stock company that operated in many ways the way companies operate today, right? You had a group of investors, there were 48 of them, that pooled their money and bought land from the state of Connecticut for $1.2 million, which that's a lot of money now. That was even more money then, right? We're talking about a lot of money. You know, one of the most famous of those was Moses Cleveland, after whom Cleveland was named. He was one of the leaders of this group. In 1795, the company issued a deed of trust to 3 men, John Caldwell, John Morgan, and Jonathan Brace, that assigned them as trustees of this entire 3 million acres. And as so, they were given the authority to survey it, to plat it, and to sell those lands. Plat means map it out, right? To map it out, to map it out into individual portions of land for individual buyers. Right. So the idea here was we're going to buy this big chunk of land, and then we're going to map it out, and then we're going to survey it, and then we're going to try to sell it to individual people, right? And for more than we bought it, right? And become wealthy off this. In 1796, 1 year later, the company decided on a method of surveying and subdividing the reserve. This is one of the first examples of a rectilinear survey system, right? So, which is really unknown in the American East, right? Surveying in the American East is done through meets and bounds survey, right? So meets are physical features in the landscape, a big tree, a big rock, a creek, right? And then bounds are straight lines drawn between those meets, right? And that's why you get land territories and private property shapes in this part of the country that are these weird, strange shapes, right? They're not regular, they're irregular. But the company decided that they would survey the reserve out into 25 square mile townships, which is different from the public land survey system, which had been decided 11 years earlier through the Land Ordinance of 1785, which called for the survey of the public domain lands of the federal government in the West. I'll show you a map in a second here that shows that. But those are 36 square mile townships. So this is different. So it's a rectilinear survey system, but it's not like the rest of the United States, west of Ohio. It's 25 square mile townships, so 5 miles on the side. And then, so if you look at maps of the Western Reserve, the survey, and then if you look at private property boundaries, they are regular, right? They're rectilinear, if you will. They're square or rectangular in size. So these townships, these rectilinear townships, were subdivided further into these square pieces of land. Surveyors were hired, and the surveying was completed by the end of 1797, which is really amazing if you think about it, right? They're going out there, and the exhibit here has some compasses and chains that were used, right, to do this. Really amazing if you think about it, right? How this was done at the end of the 18th century, on foot, by hand, using the stars, right? Using sextants, using these types of things to subdivide this place out. And another way of thinking about this is, and not to get too out there with you, but the way I think about this as a geographer is that, you know, this is a way of taking control of that territory. It's a way of stamping it, if you will. And it's an abstraction of space on a very large scale in order to take control of it by mapping it out and keeping track of who's where and when and how much land this person has, etc. And this all goes back to this European idea of land. What is land? Land is a commodity to be bought and sold, right? Which was very different from indigenous conceptualizations of land. So this is this Americanization, if you will, of the territory on a large scale. And it takes place first in Ohio and then is copied everywhere else, except Texas and except Hawaii. But everywhere else, including Alaska, is laid out in a regular rectilinear survey system. Not the 25 square mile one, a 36 square mile grid. So the Connecticut Western Reserve is unique in that instance. So in 1801, jurisdiction over the reserve passed to the United States. In essence, the United States annexed the reserve, first the Firelands and then the rest of the reserve after the Connecticut Land Company dissolved. An act of Congress in April of 1800 legalized that, and it was solidified, if you will, by a patent by President Adams in March of 1801. So the archives here at the Litchfield Historical Society has a lot of great early documents on the Connecticut Western Reserve. So Litchfield figures prominently in, it was sort of a node, if you will, of outreach to that Western Reserve. This is one of my favorite. This is the Articles of Confederation of the Connecticut Land Company here. And it's in two different books, right? And so one book deals with this, one book deals with this. And this is the records from September of 1795 to January of 1809, right there. Fascinating, just amazing to look through. It would take you forever to go through it. And I haven't looked at all of it, but it's full of all kinds of stuff, right? It's, Article 1, Article 2, Article 3. So they met many times over several months at different places in Hartford. I think they met in Litchfield a couple of times, but it was mainly in Hartford, and they got together and one person was the secretary and wrote all this stuff down. Be it resolved that we're going to do this, right? We're going to buy this land. We're going to do this. And set out all the rules for how it was to be done. Here is a list of the principals, right? Showing how much each one paid, right? So there's Moses Cleveland right there, right? And the rest of those 48. And sorry, this is a little blurry because I took it with my cell phone instead of a regular camera. This is from the Western Reserve Historical Society in Cleveland. And this shows, this is the expenses, summary of expenses for surveys, right? So they paid these three men about $4,200 to survey the Western Reserve. And those are those records. And this is what they did. This is this famous map, right? And there's a even better color version of this map in the exhibit here. And this is from this book by C. Sherman, who was with the Genealogical Society of Ohio. That he had he was a real history buff, and he wrote this book that you can still buy today called Original Ohio Land Subdivisions. And he talks about gives the history of the title to land of each of these different regions of Ohio. So here are these 25 square mile townships, right? So there are ranges. So starting here at this starting point right here, range 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., right? From east to west, and then the townships. So these lines are called range lines, these north-south lines, and then these east-west lines are called township lines. And this was really, they copied what the federal government had done in the land ordinance of 1785. That ordinance is sometimes called the Township Range Ordinance or the Township Range Survey System. But Connecticut decided on 25 square miles for one reason or the other, and I've still not been able to come up with why they decided on this, why they did. Maybe it was to be different. From the federal system, right? Because this was not part of that federal, right? This was not the part of the public domain. This was the property of Connecticut and then the Connecticut Land Company. So 25 squats, so 5 miles on the side, right? And then, but this didn't preclude people from doing with that land when they bought it what they wanted to do with it, right? So they could subdivide it, and this was one of the articles, right, in the or in those articles of Confederation, is that they stipulated that individual landowners could do whatever they want to do with that land, right? Once you buy it, survey it however you want to, divide it up into lots how you want to. But most people, because of that rectilinear survey, divided and subdivided the land into rectilinear types of shapes of lots. And that's what is showing right here. So you can see township number 8 in the 9th range, right? So this is 9 times 5. So this would be 45 miles west of the Pennsylvania-Ohio line. and township 8, so 8 times 5 would be 40 north of that, 41 degrees north. So this map showing the Federal Public Land Survey System, the PLSS, that was instituted in 1785 by the Land Ordinance of 1785. And that called for the survey of the public domain, right? That is, the public domain was this territory that had been won during the Revolutionary War, and it had been ceded by Great Britain to the United States. And then as new states and territories were added over time, the first thing that happened is that surveyors were sent out to survey that territory into this township range grid. The basic grid is a 36 square mile township, so 6 miles on the side. This is why if you've ever flown over Nebraska at 30,000 feet and you look down, what do you see? A checkerboard, right? The vast checkerboard, right? And that's, so each of those checkerboards is a square mile, right? So I grew up in Northwest Oklahoma, and I now realize, looking back on it, after I moved to Ohio, and a part of Ohio where that township range was not put in place, and where there aren't north-south lines everywhere, how ingrained that made my world, right? My world was fashioned by this north, south, east, west thing. That's how we told directions. How do you get to Old Man Johnson's farm? Oh, 4 miles north and 3 miles west, right? And that was easy to find because there's a road around every square mile, right? So it's easy. Can you do that here? No, there's no way, right? And it drives me crazy, right? My wife always goes around with me. I have to know which way north is, right? That's why I always have a Google map. So I've got to know which way north is. Else what? Otherwise, I'm lost, right? Even driving up here today is driving me insane, right? I was when am I in Connecticut? When am I not in Connecticut? And why am I going east, northeast instead of just north or something, right? And that's because it was meets and bounds. So anyway, so here are these places in Ohio that were not in the federal township range, right? The Connecticut West Reserve, the Virginia Military District, right? So Virginia was going to do the same thing. It's going to use that territory to repatriate, in their case, Revolutionary War veterans, right? So if you were a general like George Washington, you got a patent, a piece of paper that entitled you to, in his case, 10,000 acres of land in the Virginia Military District. Any 10,000 acres you want is first come, first serve, right? So you go out there, hire a surveyor to survey out 10,000 acres, and then go to the land office and put it in writing. And that's called a head right, right? You had the right to a certain number of acres land. Washington never got out there. He actually was in Ohio as a teenager, as a surveyor, but he sold his land, which a lot of Virginians did, right? Because land is money, right? So he sold his territory and never made it out there. But that map right there, I think, says a lot about who's coming where, right? So there's no other state except Texas that has the claim a map like this, where there are these different regions that were cut up. So here's the military district, the Virginia Military District, the Connecticut West Reserve, the Firelands, etc. So let's remember this schematic, this genealogical geography again, using Ohio as this root place. If we look at ancestral data and look at data, not at the census data, but at the ancestral level, family histories, family genealogies, I think we can, that map becomes clearer. That is, this is people from the upland South, mainly from Virginia and what's now West Virginia. Where are they going? When they went west, they end up in the Virginia Military District, right? So this is just 4 families that I looked at. And no, for no real particular reason other than these were families who were kind of movers and shakers, if you will, large landholders. And so there's a lot of information about them in the records. But I think you could do it with almost any family from Virginia. Most of them are going to end up in that part of Ohio. So that part of Ohio, if you go there, the Scioto Valley, it feels like Virginia, right? It looks like Virginia. It tastes like Virginia. It smells like Virginia, right? Yeah, in terms of the cultural landscape, the houses, the barns, the et cetera. These are Pennsylvania Germans coming from this area in southeast Pennsylvania. Bucks and Berks County, centered around Reading, that area. Where are they going? They're going to central Ohio. And so this is 4 families that settled in this region southeast of Columbus. What does that area look like? It looks like southeast Pennsylvania. The barns, the people's names, Dreisbach, Leiss, Roscope, Pontius. These are Germans, right? Where are New Englanders going? Well, yep, they're going from Connecticut to here. So these are again, 4 families I looked at for which we have quite a bit of information genealogically. The Talmadge family, right? Benjamin Talmadge, the Woodruff family, the Wright family, and the Bacon family. These were 4 families that were prominent in the early settlement of the Western Reserve. Even if some of them never made it out there. Benjamin Talmadge, for example, never even made it to the Western Reserve. He simply owned land there. He stayed here. In fact, he's buried and his wife in the East Cemetery. Right? So if you look at the Talmadge family, these intergenerational migrations, right? So in this case, if this is this gathering place, if you will, right? This root place where families are moving to, if we look at the paternal ancestors of George W. Talmadge, who was born here in Litchfield in 1803 and died in Summit County, that's in the Akron area, not too far from Talmadge, his family's namesake town in Ohio. You'll see that these kind of movements. In this case, even going back to the 6th generation, we're not back in Europe yet, right? So these are people who have been here. These are original families, right? So the Talmadge family has been here a long time, right? And there's the family plot there in the East Cemetery, right? There he is. This is a list of lands in the Western Reserve belonging to Talmadge and Wolcott, a company that they formed. And you can see here's in Trumbull County and in Cuyahoga County, right? That's the Cleveland area. And it shows how many acres that they own. So this is in the Talmadge papers here in the Historical Society. The Talmadge papers is really, really amazing. It has all sorts of great stuff that really, it deserves a researcher who has more time than I do to really show what he's doing. This is a land baron, right? This is a man who is very wealthy, who is buying up land in the Western Reserve and also in other parts of Ohio, and then selling that land to become quite wealthy. So he wasn't really interested in going there, right? His interest was land. And what's great about this is a lot of these documents here in the Historical Society have been copied, and because sometimes that 18th century writing and 19th century writing is sometimes hard to read, but they've been transcribed there. Really interesting stuff. Here's another one that shows his lands in Southeast Ohio. So Benjamin Talmadge was a big mover and shaker in the Ohio Company, which was another joint stock company that bought land in what's now the southeast third of Ohio, centered on Athens, where I'm from, and Ohio University, right, was put there. That was going to be another New England in the wilderness experiment. And that piece of land was about the same size as the Western Reserve, right? Yes, 2-3 million acres. And same thing happened there. They were never able to recoup the money to sell enough land to recoup what they put into it, and the company went bankrupt. And most of the land, per the stipulations of the contract with the federal government, went back into the public domain and was sold later to other people, mostly people from Virginia. and Tennessee, Kentucky. So that part of Ohio is very much, well, where I live is like going to West Virginia, right? In fact, that's where people kind of that part of Ohio kind of look for their identity. Here's Eliza Wright's grave. So Eliza Wright is another Talmadge person who wound up, that family wound up in Talmadge. Here's Eliza Wright Esquire in the Talmadge Cemetery. You see he was Phi Beta Kappa, early settler of Talmadge, first township official, founder and teacher of the high school, founder, deacon of the Congregational Church there, a mathematician. What else was he, right? I mean, father of 10 prominent grandchildren, great-great-grandfather of Virginia, you need to write that one, right? So he was also a mover and shaker. So this is the intergenerational migrations of his son, Eliza Wright II, who was born in South Canaan. You say Canaan or Canaan? Canaan. Not in Ohio, it's Canaan. Oh yeah. And died in Litchfield, Ohio. There is a Litchfield, Ohio, although it's a tiny place. It's a very, very small town. So here's this root place, his place of death, 1845, right, in Ohio. And this also, you have to go back to the fourth generation to get back to England, right? The Wright family came from Sussex. So they hadn't been in the colonies quite as long as the others. This is a map in the Portage County Recorder's Office showing Wright's lands. So here's Talmadge, and on that map they have Talmadge Circle, right? It's actually not a circle, it's a square. I don't know whether to call it circle, but so that's Talmadge, and he owned land in these townships to the west here. Several thousand acres in 1810. But by 1850, Wright had already died by this time, and he left that land to his family. But by 1850, he's only got this much. But look at the number of roads that have come in those 40 years, and Talmadge has developed even more over here. But doesn't have, the Wright family has just only about 3% of the land that they once had. They were selling it off, right? So this was what was going on in the Western Reserve. There's a lot of buying and selling of land, and that whole history needs to be worked out some more, I think. This shows Wright's land in 1810. He had over 3,200 acres. In 1860, the Wright family only has about 614 acres, about 19% of that original. So I'll leave you with this. So that's kind of some context to think about. Remember I said that the Western Reserve, like these other areas, like the Virginia Military District, it feels different, right? This is, again, with the exception of Texas, Ohio's really the major place in the country where within the boundaries of one state, it's like you can go to different states, right? It's like, so you go to the Western Reserve and you all as New Englanders, you would feel right at home because it looks, it smells, it tastes like New England in many cases. Now, it's not a complete facsimile, right? Because things are different out here in the frontier, right? Markets are different. What you can grow, the type of crops you can grow are different, right? So things are a little different out here in the frontier, but there is this kind of copying that goes on. But in Ohio, there begins to be this mix, right? Especially by the federal era, when Americans are beginning to conceive of their own identity apart from our old British identity, right? So, for example, they start naming towns not, after towns from England, like Boston and, Hartford and places like that. They begin to name towns, especially after classical place names, like Athens, right? Or Syracuse, or Troy, or Albany, or Cincinnati, or Indianapolis, Minneapolis, right? So they begin to, one of the places that, Americans begin to look back to, instead of looking back to England, after all, we just fought a war against them, right? For our own identity and political identity. Instead of looking back to England, they adopt ancient Greece and Rome, right, as this model. So it's like, I was just in DC this past weekend for a conference, and I realized, once again, that DC is a living monument to ancient Greece and Rome, right? All of the public architecture there is Greek and Roman. Most of our public architecture anywhere in the United States, county courthouses, things like that, are that. So, and that begins to happen in upstate New York and into Ohio. But they're still, these earlier settlers were coming really at the beginning of that era, and there still is in the regional landscapes of Ohio these regional identities. So what would that identity be? Well, one, it would be in the folk architecture, right? And by folk, I mean architecture styles that are up here in your head, right? How do you build a house, right? You can't www.capecodhouse.com, right? Which you could do now. But before that, it was in people's heads. That's why I'm like folk, right? As opposed to popular. And so there are throughout the Western Reserve, certain things that you notice, right? Like so-called New England large houses. I'll show you a picture of what I mean by that in a minute. Those are pretty rare, but more common are the upright and wing form and salt box and Cape Cod forms, especially salt box forms. You know what I mean by salt box? Yeah. So those are, yeah, of course you do. My students don't, right? When I say salt box, they look at me like I'm crazy, right? So those are pretty common. If you're ever out there, one of the best places to go is called Hale Farm and Village, and that is in Cuyahoga Valley National Park, which is a real gem, right? Yes, there's a national park in Ohio. It's Cuyahoga Valley, just south of Cleveland. There is, basically it's an outdoor museum where they've taken pieces of architecture, houses and things from places in the reserve and put them in one place. So there's a real congregational church, right? There's a salt box right there, an upright and wing, and this large house version. These are pretty rare. I mean, that's basically a Georgian, right? Georgian style, and with federal ornamentation. So that's kind of an Americanized. I mean, those could be found anywhere in the country during the federal period. That was the most popular house. But in the Western Reserve, this kind of 3-story one shows up. You can imagine you had to have some money, right, to build one of those. So, but anyway, so these can be found, right? You have to kind of look for them, right? Because these are folk styles, and these were replaced by popular styles later on, of course, right? A distinctive religious landscape. So congregational churches, of course, now the UCC, right? United Church of Christ. Those are, I say, rare to common because in some places, every town has one, right? In other places, you kind of have to look more for them. In the grave yards associated with many of these churches and these small towns, you can find, if you look really hard, sometimes some folk gravestone art. Nothing as wild and crazy as the death's head, what do you call that? The soul effigy, right? Which you can find out in the cemetery. You know what I mean? The soul effigy, right? The wing, the skull, and then the wings, right? Yeah, that's that's who's buried there is flown up to heaven, right? I haven't found one of those here, but I found some interesting things. I'll show you here in a minute. So here is the first congregational church, in Ohio, in Talmadge, right? And that is on Talmadge Green in Talmadge, Ohio. So Talmadge was one of the very first of these. In the Talmadge Cemetery, that's about the only one I've found throughout. I haven't been to every place, but I've been to a lot in the Western Reserve. And that's something that's what you see in Puritan New England meeting houses, right? Is the eye of God there on the pulpit. So that is really kind of interesting. And sometimes you get really lucky, right? They'll put where they were born. Here's Polly Sprague, born in Buckland, Massachusetts. And here's Emily Coe, born in Waterbury. Waterbury or Waterbury? Waterbury. And finally, there's this distinctive landscape imprint in terms of settlement patterns, right? This 25 square mile township That's ubiquitous, that's everywhere. Towns and villages, right? So even, I don't know about today, but it wasn't that long ago, I'd say maybe the 1950s, people living in the Western Reserve, when they said a town, they meant what you all mean when you say a town, right? When I say town, when most Americans say town, they mean what you all mean by a village, right? So there's Litchfield town, that's a county, and Litchfield village, right? Right, so there's a difference. So towns and villages, village greens, and villages in the center of townships with radiating roads like spokes of a wheel, right? So that is something that's not ubiquitous in New England, but it's kind of a New England thing. I'll show you what I mean. So this is a bad map. I need to redo it. Sorry, but it's this is showing these what I call green towns and villages, right? What that is, this New England model of a big congregational church on a village green. Some of these greens are oval shaped, some of them are square shaped, some of them are rectangular shaped. It just varies, but that's the case in New England even, right? Greens are sometimes circles, sometimes they're kind of ovals, like the one in Litchfield here. And then these I've mapped out also, the crosses are these historic congregational UCC churches that date back to this early settlement period, like like the one at Talmadge. So this is what Talmadge looks like. This is how it was drawn by C. Sherman in 1925. And there you can see the green, right? With these roads, Northeast Avenue, Northwest Avenue, Southeast Avenue, Southwest Avenue, right? And that's what it looks like, right? From Google Earth. You can see it from space, yeah? So there's the green right there. And it was originally a rectangle. And now they have made it this circular green. And that church I showed just a minute ago is right on that green. Look familiar? It should, right? Right, because here is this sort of model, right? This New England model. North Street, South Street, West Street, right? East Street. There's a north, a south, but there's also a northeast, a southwest, a northwest. There's Talmadge Green. Yeah. Look familiar? Pretty amazing, huh? And there's Southwest Avenue taking you down to Akron, right? So that's that Southwest Street. And then around, there are other examples. This is in Ashtabula County, which is the far northeast county of Ohio. This is a little town called Andover, right? Andover, yeah. There's the green, right? And this is in the Firelands. This is Milan, not Milan, Milan, Ohio. Yeah, Milan, yeah. Milan, right? And so there's the green, and like the green here, there's a war memorial, right? Very common. Place names, right? So New England toponyms. Here's New Lyme, named after, right? Yeah. And a lot of east-west, right? This is another New England toponym, place name style, right? Such and such center, north such and such, west such and such, south such and such. And so there's West Andover, which is just about 5 miles west of Andover. And you can go to McDonald's on Andover Square, but it's not really a square, it's a circle, right? Yeah, so this very distinctive landscape imprint as well, as a result of these regional migrations. So people tied together over time and space from here to there. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Any questions, or we can retire back there and you can hit me up afterwards. Yes, yes.
Well, I'm curious. Getting talked about this idea that the king granted charters, they were supposed to go all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Well, I'm wondering what France think of that? What did Spain think of that? I mean, wasn't that territory, that was the whole Louisiana Purchase, they never said.
Yeah, they didn't think much of it, right? Yeah. I mean, that's what, the French and Indian War was an extension of the 7 Years' War fought in Europe, which was basically over territory, conflicting claims to territory between France and England there. So this was simply an extension, it's the same thing, right? So both of those polities, most of those monarchies are claiming the whole interior of North America. And so, and that's why, so what France is doing during this period, and even much earlier, is they're coming down from the St. Lawrence Valley and the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi all the way to New Orleans, and they're kind of putting forts every once in a while, right? But if you could call them that, right? They were a small fort with, a dozen men staffed there, right? But thousands of miles away from not only France, but from the seat of activities in Quebec City. So they were far flung, right, out here. And then, Great Britain was doing the same thing, right? They were kind of putting these forts out here on the western frontier at Pittsburgh, right, to try to stave off, Fort Duquesne was about trying to stave off French intrusion. So yeah, so North America was the site of this. Not only the site of all of these different population groups from all over the world ending up here, but these conflicting claims to territory as well as a result. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
So I've known that the son of Oliver and Abigail Ellsworth from Windsor went out because he wrote a diary called A Tour of New Connecticut.
Yep.
1811. But I am now better understanding that, it was like, wow, he had 41,000 acres in the reserve.
Yeah.
It sounds like that's nothing. He was like dabbling.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, even today, 41,000 acres would be a lot. I mean, but given that there were 3.5 million acres here, right? Yeah, it was. Yeah, he was. I wouldn't call him a bit player though.
No.
I'd call him a mover and shaker. Right, just like Moses Cleveland and Talmadge and Eliza Wright. Yeah, I'd say he was. Yeah, was he one of the original 48 signers?
No. Well, so Oliver was the first Chief Justice.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not Wolf, but Oliver Ellsworth.
Yeah.
And this was his son Henry.
Okay, got it. Interesting. Yes. Yep.
So one of the Zoom questions.
Oh, I forgot. I'm sorry. I forgot my job, which you had just told me. Like,
It's coming through. So Margaret's asking, she noticed the differences between pronunciation, and if you have any idea about how widespread that is, or have looked at that at all, because something like Talmadge versus Talmadge, Canaan versus
Canaan. Yeah.
She's asking about that.
Yeah. Well, maybe, remember I was saying, talking about that Ohio was one of the first places where this new American popular culture begins to foment, if you will, begins to develop. And I think one aspect of that was was the gradual disappearance of regional dialects into, that is, a standard American dialect of English, I think, emerges out in places like Ohio. I don't think that I don't know, I can prove that quantitatively, but I would make that argument that it's places like Ohio, also adjoining areas of like Southern Michigan and Kentucky, Tennessee, right? What's amazing, however, though, for me as a geographer, is that these regional dialects persist to this day, right? So that New England dialect, and when I say dialect, I mean basically pronunciation of English, right, is still there. I mean, I'm sure you all can hear my Okie accent, right? I sound like I'm from Western Oklahoma, and that's how we do it, and I can't get rid of it no matter how hard I've done. There's a running joke among students at Ohio University because, and I don't know why this is exactly the case, but a big part of our student body comes from Northeast Ohio and Western Pennsylvania, mainly Northeast Ohio. A lot of kids from the Cleveland area, and the running joke is that everyone knows when they meet a new student, they meet someone, they know they're from Cleveland because it's Cleveland, right? that nasal New England, right? So that is, or like, yeah, like, you know what I mean, so that dialect remains. So that says something, I think, right? And you can think about all these other regional dialects, Wisconsin, right? And Minnesota, and and the South, right? Obviously the South, the deep drawl. So I think it's part of identity, right? I think we hang on to those things as part of identity, whether it's something that we are consciously doing or subconsciously, I think. Yeah. Yes.
So are there remaining to this day sort of economic ties within each of the settlement areas that then have huge influences, say, on how Ohio as a state functions?
That's a great question. I'll repeat it if you all on Zoom didn't hear it. Is the question was, are there continuing linkages like economic linkages between these different subregions of Ohio back to, say, New England and Virginia and such? I would say I wouldn't say economic so much as I would but there are still these within Ohio, these regional differences. And that's something that I think like I said, with the exception of Texas, I can't name another state where you have that. I mean, that is where people kind of look that way, figuratively, not literally, but kind of look that way. Well, if you go to Chillicothe, Ohio, which was the first capital of Ohio.
Really?
Yeah, all of those movers and shakers, all those early people who were movers and shakers politically and economically in early Ohio, who pushed for statehood and all that stuff, they were Virginians. And the economy of early Ohio was based on cattle ranching. And that's because those early Ohio framers, if you will, were all big cattle ranchers, that they had come from what's now the West Virginia Panhandle, eastern, the Shenandoah Valley area, and had copied that. That's why they were going in the first place, was because that part of Ohio is it's a big wide river valley, and it's great for cattle ranching. And it still feels that way. And there's a running joke, right? Just like in a lot of places, right? There are these stereotypes. So people in Columbus, when we talk about Chillicothe, they're like, hold your nose about Chillicothe, literally, because Chillicothe smells because there's so many cows down there, and because there's also a big paper factory down there, right? And there's a Mead paper plant there, because that part of Ohio is heavily forested, right? And so there's a big. But anyway, so yeah, and I think within the Western Reserve, although people don't, although most people wouldn't know very much about the Western Reserve at all, right? Your average person, I would hazard to guess that there was still this kind of Northeast Ohio regional identity. Cleveland feels very different from Columbus, and it feels very different from Cincinnati, right? Cincinnati is Southern, yeah, the Queen City of the West, right? Yeah.
I've had a little glimpse of some of the ties. The Connecticut Land Company was the big mercantile powers in Connecticut, coming together with a lot of other merchants. And my family was involved in that, and the lesser level. And they did bring a lot of they developed canals and so
Yeah.
forth, transport to feed into the Connecticut mercantile system.
Yeah.
And there was resource of wheat, oats, and other things that were coming back and coming by the water routes.
Yeah.
To the Connecticut economy.
Yeah.
And the other thing that was really, it's so interwoven, but the land investment saved the Connecticut economy because it was a currency of exchange, like a banking system that supplemented the non-existent continental currency.
Yeah, that's
as a bridge.
Yeah. So land is money.
Funny.
Land is a commodity, right? Yeah.
So I saw a lot of trading of that.
Yeah, and yeah, you make a great point. The question for those on Zoom was about the economic linkages between early on in the early settlement era between here and between Connecticut here and the Western Reserve. And Yeah, so these canals were really important, and those were built, before the railroads. Those were built to get these agricultural products by water back to the markets. The markets weren't in Ohio so much as they were back east, and the cheapest way of moving goods is via water. Yeah, even if you have to dig a canal over the Appalachians, right? It's cheaper than and faster than on foot. Yeah.
I'd like to mention also, just because it's so crazy and so interconnected with my little study and my family. My great grandfather moved to Ohio in 1802. And his son Frederick was born here in Litchfield and helped build one of those canals and was very prosperous, built one of those large brick houses out in Portage, Ohio.
Oh, yeah.
And then died in Eureka, California, because all his children had moved to Eureka, California on the coast, and he put $5,000 into the founding of Eureka.
Yeah, there's that model, right? Right. So if the Western Reserve was this kind of group gathering place, right? So the subsequent generations are out west.
The untold story is that they were determined to build the American empire after the revolution to counteract the other world empires, and they knew they were going to be greater than the other empires because they had more land
And resources. Yeah.
The other thing that's a mystery that people aren't aware of is the importance of the Highland Command under Washington and the Connecticut line, who was the bridge that were fighting on two fronts: the ocean of the West and the ocean of the Atlantic Ocean. And they were so aware of their vulnerability that they were architects of this westward movement, both in the Ohio Company and in the Connecticut Land Company. Most of them were the architects, and the people that actually went out there were military men from the Highland Command.
Yeah. This is the case in Virginia as well. The Virginia
They
military.
were friends, though. They had a model for friendship.
Yeah. All those Virginians were like Revolutionary War veterans.
They learned they forged an identity during the war that became a basis for friendship and amiability in Ohio that was unseen on the East Coast.
Yeah. There's this mixing. Yeah, exactly. It was coming together. Yep.
We have a couple more from the internet.
Sure.
Oh, yeah, so Bill asked, talking a lot about how the human settlements look very like Connecticut. Bill was asking, what was the landscape like? Was it forested? Was it like, today we know kind of these flat farms. Yeah. But what was it like?
It was the original, what geographers call the potential or the natural vegetation was heavily forested. Yeah, in fact, if you look at early surveyor notes, I haven't looked at the surveyor notes for the ones who were in the Western Reserve, but I'll bet they're very similar. I've read surveyor notes in Eastern Ohio, and they describe having to hack their way with machetes through the forest. And so, of course, that was all cut down very quickly in a pre-industrial society, you need wood for everything, right? You've got a fire going 24/7 for cooking, for heating, you're building with it. You're making charcoal out of it to smelt iron and things like that. So, but today there's much more forest than there was at any time since the earliest settlement. The forests were cut down. I've seen pictures of Athens, Ohio, where I live, which is this very hilly region and heavily forested today. But I've seen pictures in the 1920s, and there are no trees.
Yeah.
There are no trees whatsoever. They've all been cut down. And so I've read that I forget where the source is, but I've read that there's more forest cover now in the United States than there has been since about 1750. Yeah. So, yes.
If somebody bought a plot of land that had a river running through it,
Yeah.
do they own the water rights or?
That's a good question. The question was that if you bought land and there was water on it, did you own that? And that I'm not sure. I can tell you that this was an issue. Tornado? That's what, where I grew up in Oklahoma, you'd be running for the shelter right now. The twister's coming. I do know that in later years, as people got out into the West, that became an issue, water rights and mineral rights. Now, in most of the East, those laws were based on English common law. And in English common law, if you bought a piece of land, you got everything under that land and on that land. So you would have owned that, the mineral rights and such. Further west, where water is at more of a premium, that changed. So like in the Great Plains, for example, you can even to this day when you buy a piece of land, you have to buy the water and mineral rights separate to it. So you could sell, like my dad just sold part of our family farm, but he didn't sell the mineral rights. So he sold the land, but he didn't sell what's underneath it. Because that was bought separately. Yeah.
You mentioned though that Pennsylvania, so Pennsylvania is a commonwealth.
Yep.
And Virginia is a commonwealth, but Connecticut's not.
Yeah.
So you're getting into this common law of origination. How did they settle that? How did they settle? Because was this when the settlement was first created that they would get away, they would do away with any mineral rights?
Yeah, the question is again about mineral rights, and I'm not really sure, but it's something that really interests me, and I'm sure someone has written about this. Some historian has talked about this, I'm sure. But if you'll give me your name and email, I think I know a book that talks about this, and I could send it to you. I'm not really quite sure how that worked. But you're right. There was all this idea of common lands, right? That's what Greens were about, and that was based on old sort of Middle Ages conceptualizations of land ownership going back, back to the Middle Ages. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I grew up in Cleveland, and I don't know if I sound like that, but everything was.
No, not too much.
Some questions for that, but
Yeah.
And my, actually, and my ancestors got those land grants from half of the family, the other half from the Virginia military. academy,
Really?
the southern
Interesting.
part of Ohio too, and then others came in to Pennsylvania, but, my question for you is, everything was Western Reserve this, Western Reserve that, there's the Western Reserve University, there's University Circle, all those Western Reserve Historical Society.
Yeah.
I took Ohio history my whole, all through school. Never until I met my husband and we started studying the history of the Western Reserve of Connecticut.
Yeah.
Was it ever called the Western Reserve of Connecticut?
Yeah, so-
I didn't learn that until like.
So why it was called the Western Reserve, he didn't really.
It's
Yeah.
dropped the Connecticut.
Yeah.
So why is that? That nobody, if you ask anybody in that area,
Yeah.
well educated, what's the history of the term Western Reserve?
Yeah.
They will not have. a clue.
But you're right, it's as a kind of a place name, as like, there's Western Reserve, like, businesses named Western Reserve.
Money up for our school systems.
Yeah.
Case Western Reserve.
Case Western, yep, yeah. Oh, and speaking of school system, yeah, that's another really important aspect of this is, when the company was dissolved, a lot of that money, not most of it, I think, went to fund the first public education system in Connecticut. So, and there's a whole article I have that I've written by this historian back in the 30s, I think. It's all about this, about how that funded. Yeah. Yes.
Question. I was fascinated by this statement that this lady here says there was part of Connecticut that went all the way out to the west coast.
Yeah.
Did anybody then actually go out to what is now California?
No.
And say,
Not that I know of, but that's, that area, yeah, now there had been British explorers, Vancouver, right, had gone there Vancouver's out there in the 1720s or 30s, I think. And, claims that West Coast for Great Britain. But that's really a outpost, man, that is a long ways away. And before before Lewis and Clark, 1803, 1804, there's not a lot of knowledge about that area. There's a lot of guessing about what's out there. And there's if you read, pamphlets in papers, newspapers, East Coast from that era, there's a lot of the idea is that this is kind of this Garden of Eden out there that's ours, that if we could just get there, right? But then Lewis and Clark comes back and they said, South Dakota is no Garden of Eden, right? And so that Garden of Eden idea kind of gets switched until Germans from Russia come in the 1880s and realize that this is a garden out there because it's a steppe grassland and you can grow wheat in a steppe grassland.
Yeah.
And so they kind of reverse that again. But anyway, to answer your question, yeah, I don't think that there was a lot of, there were French fur trappers out there, a lot of French fur trappers who had sort of gone wild and intermarried with indigenous women. Those are the Métis. Have you ever heard of the Métis? Yeah, those are in the prairie provinces of Canada. Those are the ancestors of those unions. But the geopolitical hold on that whole territory, that Intermountain West, was very tenuous at best. And it was, the Spanish had claimed that area and the British had claimed it. The United States is now claiming it, right? And that really isn't settled until 1848, when Great Britain and the United States finally agree on that 49th parallel as it almost came to blows again, right? There was almost a new War of 1812. Yeah, 49-40 or fight. Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.